Change Department. I know most of you, not all of you. And I am so delighted and honored to welcome Dr. Mohamed Abdou, who's joining us as our visiting scholar this month. And he will be offering 3 lectures, beginning with tonight, followed by tomorrow and the night after. And part of our visiting lecture series includes the publication of the lectures through our imprint with PM Press, Kairos. So please look out for that publication. We're hoping within a year for the conversation, the lectures and the conversations that will be transcribed and after the editorial process will be published. And I am so honored that Dr. Abdou accepted our invitation to come and speak with us and share his work. Many of you know of his work already, but I will read you his bio. I'm sorry that I have to read, but it's much more too extensive for me to have been able to just share. But Dr. Abdou is a North African Egyptian Muslim anarchist, interdisciplinary activist, scholar of Indigenous, Black, critical race, and Islamic studies, as well as gender, sexuality, abolition, and decolonization, with extensive fieldwork experience in the Middle East, North Africa, Asia, and Turtle Island. Last year, he was our visiting professor, assistant professor of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University. He's a former assistant professor of sociology at American University of Cairo, and recently completed his postdoctoral fellowship at Cornell University. He has also taught at the University of Toronto and Queen's University. His research stems from his involvement with the anti-globalization, post-Seattle 1999 movements, organizing for Palestinian liberation, the Tyendinaga Mohawks and the sister territories of Kanawake, Akwesasne, and Kanesatake during the standoff over the Culbertson Tract, as well as the anti-war protests of Iraq and Afghanistan, the Indigenous Zapatista movement in Chiapas, and the 2011 Egyptian uprisings. He is author of Islam and Anarchism, Relationships and Resonances, published with Pluto Press in 2022. And he wrote his transnational ethnographic and historical archival PhD dissertation on Islam and queer Muslims, identity and sexuality in the contemporary. So please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Abdou, who's going to speak under the series title of Qur'an of the Oppressed. And thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Abdou.
Please allow me this moment. And thank you very much, all of you, for coming. And before everything else, anything else, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon you all, and shalom al-khaim to our Jewish siblings in the room. I usually start any talk, any speech, anything that I write with Musa's dua. Musa's prayer in the Qur'an when they were about to meet Pharaoh, accompanied by his brother Aaron. Allahumma shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Allahumma shrah li sadri, O Ya Allah, O Adonai, open thy breast, wa yassir li amri, and make my affairs easy. This is not easy. Not because of ostensibly the colds or the bout of colds that I've been stricken with, maybe a cleansing, nor necessarily because of the weight, the responsibility that lies before me here. but also being stricken with being back at the heart of empire. يسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني فقولي and undo the knot in my tongue, such that my affairs become easy, such that what it is that I have to share with all of you, and I am here simply to share what has been bestowed upon me, bequeathed upon me, to me, by our ancestors. I say our ancestors, not mine. Bequeathed towards, hopefully, liberation beyond the element of resistance. واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي, so that what it is that I have to share with you reaches your hearts, your spirits, as well as your mind. We are certainly in a war, and I'm going to emphasize this point, of our hearts, and not just simply minds. Before all else, my immense gratitude and thanks to Darul, to Andre, to Sean, and honestly, to Hannah Gallender, to Zachariah, Gail House, to Linda Kikevitz, without whom I honestly would not be here today. And I sincerely mean that, of course, my family. But really, they have formulated the tight network of the circle over the past 7-8 months, to which the very unraveling of violence, internal violence, as Fanon teaches, colonization is an inherently violent act, took its toll on me to the point of almost suicide. Alhamdulillah, I am where I am at now because of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because of family, because of community. And community reveals itself in times not only of good, but in times of wicked evil, of struggle, in times which the devil appears before our very eyes. The devil that exists within us, the devil that exists within the system, the devil that exists amongst everybody. And there is a devil inside each and every single one of us. We are, after all insecure, fearful. But that is what community is for. One that accepts us for who we are constantly becoming, because there is no sense of a being. But I also have to give thanks to the fact that upon my arrival the day before yesterday, me, a settler of color, I, whatever this I is.
Seems like maybe a fuse blew, so we're gonna try to fix that, but it might take.
Now that's what I'm saying already.
See what you did.
It's all that devil talk.
What if we?
You're already all in my heart.
Moving off to close of the road.
Should we move in?
I think we can move closer.
To them?
I'm grateful for this interlude and interruption that cuts tension vis-a-vis an animal. Given what it is that I sensibly have to, like I said, share. And as I was noting, and of course I cannot neglect what is due unto all of you, because I do mean your grace, your presence, your kind hospitality, your generosity, your capacity to listen, to bear with me. A raving lunatic engaged in some kind of madness is incredibly humbling. And it is an incredible honor to be amongst you all and our audience that is online. You really are all an intersection of stars. And I mean that, worlds, cosmos, that I've yet to get to know, to be honored to get to know. The fact that you've graced this presence here is enough to feel that. But as I was saying, as somebody who just landed on the shores of Turtle Island in so-called San Francisco, my responsibility, I am reminded constantly, though I never forget it, even though I'm in Egypt these days, is to the fact that I am also a settler of color on Turtle Island. A settler specifically on the ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Lani people in so-called the San Francisco Peninsula. And this isn't, like I said, lost or forgotten upon me, nor should it. You see, because this is about a politics of responsibility, a politics of caretaking. I was taught by my Indigenous elders that land acknowledgements are not some kind of pedantic, superficial set of words that we proclaim, but rather they are about intent, purpose, and action. And I'm going to repeat that again. Intent, purpose, and action. And in this Orwellian moment that we are living, and dare I say, October 7th, in which 11,000 shells, if one has the capacity to even conceive of these numbers and the consequences of them. 500 heavy 1-ton bombs and 118 missiles were released by the Zionist entity on what is referred to as the Gaza envelope, i.e. the Zionist entity's side of the Gaza perimeter fence, vis-a-vis the mass Hannibal directive. As of Israeli occupation, Air Force Colonel Nof Erez had recently called it, the equivalent of 2 nuclear ordinances. But there's a degree of hypocrisy here, because I'm not just talking about a genocide that is 75 or even 100 years old. I'm talking about a genocide that goes back to 1492, a genocide that has been ongoing for 533 years, a genocide that has been leveled upon me and my siblings and our ilk, the very salt of the earth, by white supremacy, white Christian supremacy, to be even more blunt. White liberal Christian supremacy, to even be more specific. Liberalism is the very bosom of white supremacy, more than white conservative supremacy could ever embody. But this is the Orwellian moment in which words and their meanings disappear. Empire loves euphemisms. George Orwell, double speak, he called it, 1984. First they steal the words, then they steal the meanings, he notes. Empty and hollowed out words like axis of evil, war against terror, simulated drowning, preventive war, as civilians that are murdered, that are killed, are referred to as collateral damage. CIA kidnappings, extraordinary renditions, liberal hollowed out words. But then that brings me to the concept of the politics of translation and mistranslation of language. English isn't my first language. It's my adopted tongue. My native tongue is Arabic. And the politics of translation and mistranslation, as Sabah Mahmoud, as late Sabah Mahmoud, Joseph Mas'ad, Spivak had noted, is precisely a crisis of language. Islam, anarchism, the rule was kind, and of course I was the one that offered the bio of me being a Muslim anarchist. Now what does a Muslim anarchist even mean or signify? An anarchist Muslim or a Muslim anarchist? Doesn't make a difference what comes before the other. What if I believe that Islam is inherently anarchistic? Now of course it's a game of ploy, of words, of audience, of strategy, of tactic, of trying to fuse together an identity or a set of identities vis-a-vis a set of conjunctive ands, because I'm not a set of disjunctive ors. I'm a Muslim and an anarchist and a feminist, person of color, North African, Arab, Egyptian, and so on and so forth. But the world confines us to a set of carceral prison of identities, LGBTIQ, BIPOC. What the hell is BIPOC? Do we not have black indigenous people or black people of color? But that is how white liberal supremacy functions. And we internalize these prisons and reproduce them constantly. But the crisis goes even deeper when Islam is mistranslated constantly by Orientalists, Muslim, and non-Muslims alike as submission. Islam does not mean submission because the actual word for submission in Arabic is khudu', completely different words. Islam comes from the 3-letter root salam, sin, lam, mim, to willfully deliver upon choice. But why is it mistranslated to submission? They give the indication that these human animals, as we refer to, simply submit without critical thinking, without reflection, without thought, despite that the Qur'an teaches me, teaches us, and uses phrases like أَلَا يَتَفَكَّرُونَ أَلَا يَعْقِلُونَ أَلَا يَفْقَهُونَ. Do they not think? Do they not reflect? Do they not ponder and wonder? Anarchism is equally mistranslated, if you will, in Arabic. In English, of course, is chaos, is anarchy, when it means leaderless movements. Okay. In Arabic, similarly, it is referred to as fawdawiyya, which is the equivalent of chaos or anarchy. But the actual translation, as Professor Ibn Rauf Izzat had pointed, a political scientist at Cairo University as لا سلطوية, without authority. But then, where does that leave room for al-ghayb, or the unknown? Because there are verses in the Qur'an that are known as the verses of al-ghayb, or the unknown. Nobody knows the meaning of them. Chapter 2, chapter of the cow, begins with the verse Alif Lam Mim, 3 Arabic letters conjoined to form an Arabic word that nobody knows the meaning of. Not a single Muslim scholar can tell you the meaning of that word. There are more blank spaces on a page, folks, than what's written in black. But this is where ijtihad, or critical reasoning and thought, comes into play. And ijtihad is not an individual affair in Islam, it is one that is collective, one that builds on a politics of citation, political act within itself. But al-ghayb, this is my problem with historical and dialectical materialism, that erases any sense of cosmology whatsoever, let alone spirit. Tell me, can you love without spirit? Can you relate to land that is a spiritual subject without spirit? She's not an object. I shudder to think Muslims that bend their asses to the sky 5 times a day in prayer and supposedly memorize the Qur'an. Well, how many chapters in the Qur'an are labeled after non-human life? The chapter of the sun, the chapter of the moon, the chapter of the thunder, the chapter of the bees, the chapter of the ants, the chapter of the elephant, and I can continue on, literally and metaphorically. Do we not reflect upon the wisdom of Adonai, of Creator, naming chapters after non-human life? What becomes then of our responsibility towards non-human life in this age of climate crisis? And what do we leave behind to our children? Our children that, as Mu'miya, political prisoner, Mu'miya Ijana refers to as our children that come from immortality. They are the arrows that we shoot towards infinity. What do we leave behind? In memory, in materiality, in cosmology, in symbolism. 2 beautiful chapters. The chapter of announcements, or al-Nada, chapter 78, verses 66 to 7. Have we not made, Allah says, Adonai says, have we not made the earth as wide expanse and the mountains as pegs? Mountains as pegs. These phallic buildings, they measure nothing in comparison to mountains. Yet we build them as if we're about to dethrone God and replace ourselves as demigods, vying for God's space and power. Ayatul Nur, the chapter of the light, says, chapter 24, verse 43. Do you not see that Allah gently drives the clouds, then joins them together, piling them up into masses from which you see raindrops come forth? And He sends down from the sky mountains of clouds loaded with hail, pouring it on whoever He wills and averting it from whoever He wills. Surah Ar-Ra'd, the chapter of the thunder, verse 12. هو الذي يريكم البرق خوفا وطمعا وينشئ السحاب الثقال. He is the one who shows you lightning, inspiring you with hope and fear, and produces heavy clouds. The war between the above and the below, the land and the sky, that makes the very earth cry. Who am I? Where am I? Who is speaking? And what am I doing here? Well, I am born of the desert, and I come to you from the desert. That is my homeland. That is my place of belonging, and truth be told. And like the lion of the desert, Omar al-Mukhtar, the Libyan Sunusi warrior who stood against the Italians in his own homeland, the Libyan warrior who stood against the French colonizers in Chad and the British occupation in Egypt before his capture and execution on September 11, 1933, I am as Omar. I am as Mohamed of the desert, like Moses of the desert, and like Jesus as well, like Isa. At 14, and one can engage in lots of storytellings, and I've been raised and blessed with an incredible life that I'm still trying to fathom and understand the very purpose of. At a moment in my life in which I'm being labeled by people like Elon Musk as a traitor, in which I am being depicted by the present Secretary of Defense, Hegseth, on Fox News, Jesse Waters, and many others. I am of Black Hajar, Sarah's handmaiden. That is how I came about. At 14, and perhaps that is the earliest memory, before I broke out of my mother's womb and was severed vis-a-vis an umbilical cord and my very connection to her, and this is why I say What is the I? What is the I when I was a wee within my mother's womb? I breathed through her. I was sheltered, naked, barren as anything birthed within her, within that womb. She fed me. I even shat through her. My entire existence was unmediated without her. And yet I am here, and my earliest memory is 14. My parents' library that was quite capacious with a lot of different books. I remember Alex Haley's Malcolm being at the center of it, while an image of Jamal Abdel Nasser who had signed a picture of him for my father. I grew up in a household of Nasserites, of Sadatists as well. My great-grandparents were farmers. My grandparents were teachers, school teachers. And at 14, here I am with Alex Haley's Malcolm's biography and Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, which is his most fundamental book, at least in my mind. Not The Wretched of the Earth or any other book, because he taps into the very psychoanalytic, or should I say, schizoanalytic recesses of what happens to people of color. To the extent that we straighten our hair, that we want to color our eyes with lenses blue, that we want to scrape the very color of our skin white, vis-a-vis skin bleaching screens, the degree of self-hate and resentment that goes at the very level of intimacy. In chapter 3, when he provokes the very character of Jean Venus, the Antillean black man, wise, knows 5 languages. White people want to be him, but he wants to be like white people. That he falls in love with a white woman, Josephine, and he questions the fact of whether he loves her for the sake of loving her, or whether he loves her because he wants to reenact all the atrocities, all the violence, all the wrath of the earth that has been visited upon his body, upon her body that is an extension of the land. Be careful, Jean Venus, lest people see us on the subway and call you a big black bear. And of course, there was Antoine Artaud's Le Théâtre et son double, the theater and its double. This is the movie theater. This is where the real world manifests. Beyond, of course, Oventique and the jungles of our siblings in Chiapas. La Realidad. I will never forget that on my first visit to the Zapatistas in 2011. Everything that you came from is a facade, is fake. This is the reality. 1492. Well, now we get to the very bosom of things, and I'm going to try and speed things up. I do want to allow us time for Q&A, so forgive me, but this sets the very tone, the substance of hopefully the next 2 lectures and engagements. So if we don't get as much engagement today, forgive me, but this really sets the principles, if you will, of the conversation I'm seeking to share. 1492. 2 fundamental things happened in 1492. Muslims and Jews were referred to as savages and heathens. Pay attention. Savages being the racial definition. Heathen being the religious. In Al-Andalus, in Granada. Granada, I say. By Ferdinand and Isabel, who are about to lay siege to Spain after 800 years of Muslim presence. And I'm not here out to romanticize, by the way, for any detractors, 1,445 years of Muslim history. There is no going back to 1492. There is no going back to time of Mohamed or the time of Isa. That there's something I want from that time. I want the spiritual, ethical, political commitments that formulated the very foundations of those nascent communities. But alas, lest I digress even more. Savages and heathens we were referred to by Ferdinand and Isabel. We were murdered, we were raped, we were pillaged, we were persecuted, we were forcibly converted. Okay. Something else, though, happened that very same year, I think something that we're very well aware of. Columbus's conquistador invasion of the Americas. When Columbus writes in his diaries, he refers to the Taino people as savages and heathens. Describes indigenous people as savages and heathens. Then we find Hernan Cortez's diaries, the 15th, 16th century conquistador, who comes about and says, and describes Aztec women as Moorish women, Aztec temples as Moorish mosques. Montezuma, the Aztec leader, as a sultan, he says. Even the term used to describe two-spirit people, Berdach, was originally cast
on gender non-conforming Muslims. A third to a fifth of our siblings, transatlantic Middle Passage slaves, were black Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula and the west coast of Africa. And you don't want to tell me that this is a religious war, that this is a cosmological war? Sure, it has racial dimensions within it. Absolutely, nobody can deny that. But make no mistake, this is a cosmological and religious war. You cannot understand race without religion and vice versa. And lest I say, or digress even further before noting this point, that this is not a war between Muslims and Jews, but rather a war that Muslims and Jews have been conscripted into vis-a-vis white supremacist interpretations of Christianity that was usurped underneath Constantine and weaponized as an imperial tool towards conquest. Christianity is an Eastern tradition. So is Judaism, so is Islam. Three branches of the same tree. And this imprint has been reflected upon Islam in the form of Muslim Brotherhood and Wahhabi thought, onto Judaism in the manifestation of Zionism. And Christianity, obviously, vis-a-vis the crusading logic that it deploys. So Islam and 1492 are the two elephants in the room, like I said. And Columbus was born into a Europe that is anti-Islamic, whose stage and mindset had been set in 1451, and he was raised on tales of the Crusades and territorial losses of Genoa that were suffered after the Ottoman Empire's capture of Constantinople in 1453. Now, very interestingly enough, that perhaps not a lot of people know this, perhaps they do, that Columbus relied on a man by the name of Abu Rayhan al-Biruni, a 10th century Khawarisian Persian polyglot Muslim scholar who mastered Arabic, Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit, and not only calculated the Earth's radius and rotation, but also devised an improvised quadrant to measure the very height of the sun, and developed even methods to determine the density of substances through the ratio of mass to volume. So he laid actually the foundation to Galileo, to Newton. And Columbus was motivated, of course, by the very hope of delivering Jerusalem from Muslims. He was all the way to fund his crusade vis-a-vis India, and he got lost. And he got lost by using the very resources, i.e. Muslim resources, that had been passed on to him, but that he misinterpreted. And he wanted to use these resources for newly discovered lands. And in addition to al-Biruni, he also relied on somebody else who was Muslim, or happened to be Muslim. He had relied, but also again misread, the medieval Iraqi geographer. Of course, there wasn't an Iraq at the time, but the Baghdadi, let's say, geographer, an 8th century Muslim, Abu al-Abbas Ahmed ibn Muhammad al-Kathir al-Farghani, often known as al-Farghanas in English. 1 degree at the equator is equal to 56.67 miles. Columbus, of course, his first error, which he compounded with a second, is that he assumed that the Persian and the Iraqi were using the caliber of 4,856 foot Roman miles. They weren't. In fact, Alfranjus meant the 7,091 foot Arabic mile. But of course, Columbus, in his ignorance and his misreading, miscalculated. SubhanAllah. Columbus himself thought that he was navigating according to Alfranjus' value. And he wrote, "Observe that in sailing often from Lisbon southward to Genoa, I carefully measured the course. In an agreement with the Alfranjan, I found that each degree answered 56 2/3 miles, so that we may rely upon this measure." Taken together, of course, the two miscalculations effectively reduced the planetary waistline to 16,305 nautical miles from an actual 21,600,000, or so, an error of about 25%. Of course, there was a third error that Samuel Eliot Morison had writes about in the Admiral of the Ocean Sea. Not content with whittling down the degree by 25%, Columbus stretched out Asia eastward until Japan almost kissed the Azores. Through a complicated chain of reasoning, delinquent reasoning, one might add, that mixed Ptolemy, Marinus of Tyre, and Marco Polo with some corrections of his own, Columbus calculated that he would find Japan at 85 nautical west longitude rather than 140 degree east. moving it more than 8,000 miles closer to Cape St. Vincent, hence a margin error of 58%. Of course, Morrison noted Columbus's calculation is not logical. I don't, by the way, place much on logic and rationality. All rationality is a region carved out of that which is rational. One rationalizes God, another sees God as irrational. But that's the point. What is God is an irrelevant question in this whole equation. But Columbus's mind was not logical. He knew he would make it, and figures had to fit in his mind. Remind you of something? Point being, the new world is built in this simulacric image of the old. It has not changed. This is a crusading war. And the devil is everywhere. And I'm here under the auspices of introducing these series of lectures vis-a-vis the Qur'an, or what I refer to as the Qur'an of the oppressed, that builds obviously on Islam and anarchism, but hopefully in more accessible, less citational form. And I myself am caught between becoming an earth eater because fascism is a mass psychology. I've got inner fascisms that exist within me. And subscribing to the worlds of the below, the downtrodden, the poor, the elderly, the orphans, women, children, all the destitute, all those on the margins of the margins, if you will. But you come about and you tell me that this is a secular society, supposedly. Well, what about in God we trust on the dollar bill, that we all covet, that we all worship, that we all bow down on our knees towards in our 5 or 7 to 5 jobs, maybe even more than that, if we're talking about single mothers trying to feed their 2 or 3 children. And that is my battle, that is my energy, that is my greater struggle that I constantly and try as much as possible to be vigilant against. But I cannot do that on my own without the presence of community. That reminds me of that battle and that helps me towards the course of that battle against my inner fascisms, micro-fascisms, a topic that we're going to get into a lot these coming days. But manifest destiny, doctrines of discovery, terranealism. Like I said, in God we trust on the dollar bill, Victorian notions of gender and sexuality, Protestant conceptualizations of property. So let me say from the get-go, America is false to the present and false to the future. It still relives its genocidal past that is ongoing, its homicidal present, and its suicidal future. And it will take down the entire globe with it. The age of Trump, I will say, that builds on the age of Mr. Genocide Joe, and before him, Mr. Trump, and before him, Biden, and the litany that stretches back to the founding fathers, only demonstrates how white supremacy and racist alt-right platforms can be simultaneously anti-Jewish and supportive of Zionism. And I say anti-Jewish because Arabs are Semites too. So we need to rethink about this concept of anti-Semitism. So the US and Canada's historical anti-Jewishness is part of a common history of the enslavement of black people, of 1923 Chinese exclusion acts, of Tuskegee trials, Japanese internment camps, and so on and so forth, of slavery, of indentured servitude. It is an extension of it, not exceptional to it. And the doctrine contract between Zionist Israel and the evangelical liberal Euro-America is very simple. It is to use the Zionist entity, in a utilitarian and strategic relationship of mutual conveniences. The goal of such an alignment is to usher in the second coming of Christ, the return of the Jewish Messiah, through an alliance between both of these. Israel rests on the very white supremacist and Zionist European control of the meaning of Judaism, far remote from its non-white and non-Zionist understandings. This is a fight between the world of the above and the world of the below. And this is, yes, a racial and religious war, a war of all against all, and a war where all wars fit. My siblings, we are in an incredible state of urgency and emergency, because unlike any other time, there are 3 factors that define our present moment, unlike any other moment in human history. Like I said, this very spiritual subject, land, that provides the very air that we breathe, the very thamarah, the food that we eat, the seeds that blossom into vegetables and fruits. The 3 sisters here on Turtle Island. Is crying an elegy of complaint, a great way for us to listen to her, to heed. And yet we do not. And not only for her, but for our own sanctity, for our own indigeneity, for our own, what is in Islam known as the fitra, original nascent belonging. Any child is born inherently so to connect with community. They're inquisitive, they're imaginative, and yet we lose our capacity to dream dangerously every single moment as we grow into adulthood because we begin to invest in the world of the above. But a child wants to connect with a rose, with a flower, that grows out of the concrete pavement as a big middle finger and fuck you to civilization and modernity. I existed before you and I shall exist after you. The child is born not seeing the black and white, to connect with their fellow siblings. Not gendered, not racialized. Before we dress them in pink or blue and define them as black and white. The second thing is the fact that we have been spending the past 16 months, 15 months of a genocide that is ongoing in the context of our beloved Palestine, our boussole, our compass. We need to actually listen to Palestine, and this is why I don't buy into 48 or 1917 narrative. That's preimposing and ignores the 1492 product that ought to be emphasized. But we are trying to act as if we are going to free Palestine, and what the hell does freeing Palestine even mean? It's a different subject I'll get to in a few minutes. Vis-a-vis scrolling through genocide on devices made of copper and cobalt of another genocide in the Congo. The irony. We're lying to ourselves. We're caving into the devil. We're avoiding the very actions that need to be done. Again, intent, purpose, and action here. Am I not a Zionist on stolen land here? As an Arab, as Muslim, as diasporic Palestinian, sorry, I'm not of this land. And unless, again, you're indigenous or a descendant of the Middle Passage, we are not of this land. And it does not belong to you. And yet we all buy into hyphenated American identities, the Native American, the Black American, the Muslim American, the Asian American, the queer American, the I don't know what American, yet the only American that doesn't hyphenate their identity is the white American because they're assumed to be the native of the land. Look at Mr. Trump now, who wants to remove quote-unquote birthright citizenship from Native Americans. So I don't buy into this hyphenated BS. Native Americans or indigenous people, actually, as they need to be referred to, become only relevant to empire when their names are on football teams like the Washington Redskins or Tomahawk weapons and Apache helicopters, weapons of mass destruction. Which brings me to the third point, that never in human history have we garnered enough capacity to completely annihilate one another, Hiroshimas and Nagasaki's, in an instant. Again, 2 nuclear bombs or the equivalent of dropped on Gaza. So make no mistake, your America is leading this war. Israel is but an instrument in this ploy. So I'm tired of talking about surviving, and I'm tired actually of also talking about resistance. That's boring, that's dull. Surviving and resistance are reactionary postures. I want to talk, for me and my people, in the language of thriving. We deserve to live, we deserve to breathe. I want to talk about the language of liberation. These are active stances. Sun Tzu had written, if you fail to recognize the scope and the nature of the enemy, you will succumb in every battle. So without addressing Islam in 1492, we'll continue to have false analogies of free Palestine, of Arab slavery is akin to white slavery, supposedly. And I'm not condoning, by the way, slavery, but sorry, when you engage in this ahistorical comparison, it's BS. Okay? Particularly in the context of Islam. And I can get into this point deeper. Muslim societies do not rely on plantation economies. The slave that existed also within Roman, Jewish, and Christian cultures as well, and again, I'm not condoning slavery, was not racialized. The majority of actually slaves during the Muslim era were Circassians, and they had rights. They were considered to be human beings, unlike, again, plantation economies that the white man had devised. But without dealing with 1492, again, and Islam, we remain entangled in false binaries. My choices, folks, are not going to be between a Zionist Wahhabi crusading alliance on the one hand, a Russian totalitarian and Chinese, Iranian axis on the other. I reject those false binaries. I'm sorry. But this is where Islam becomes the linchpin of everything. As this savage, the uncivilized, the heathen, the everything. Muslims are more queerophobic than every community. We're more sexist than every community. And look at how Islamophobia is deployed. This is why what happened with Lee is not an example of a new McCarthyism, as some people have named it, but Islamophobia that very much formulates the very bosom of a 1492 project upon which this society and every society is now founded upon. Look at what's happening with Dalits and Kashmiris. Vis-a-vis, again, Hindu power, white supremacist understanding, insofar as Hindu nationalism. Do we want to talk about Buddhism in the context of Myanmar and what's happening with the Rohingya? Let alone, again, the context of Palestine. Do we want to talk about China in the context of the Uyghur? The deployment of Islamophobia, the linchpin of everything that is evil in the world. We will never be able to deal with pinkwashing in the Zionist entity that relies on not only anti-Palestinian rhetoric, whose heart is actually Islamophobia, without dealing with homonationalism here, and the conscription of LGBTQ and queer causes for imperialist ends, for conquest, for conquering. So it all comes back to here, the big monster staring all of us in the mirror, as opposed to the small monster. Deal with the big monster. That's what I tell our people, my people. But unfortunately, they don't want to heed that, and they think that we're going to free Palestine without dealing with the fact that we are Zionists on stolen land. I don't care how we got here. There's always agency and choice. And again, privilege does not circulate the same way as complicity. I'm not saying that an Afghani refugee or a Palestinian this and that enjoys the same privileges as a white man. Absolutely not. That would be insane. But they are still complicit in indigenous dispossession here. So good luck with freeing Palestine without contending with that fact. So yeah, basta, and I'm really tired and enough with the narrow conceptualizations of religion. Marxism has become a religion. Anarchism is a religion. Capitalism is a religion. The nation state is a religion. What religion are we talking about here? That confines this concept of religion within colonial power structures. Where is Malcolm's project? That becomes the question, and this is how I arrived here. Where is Ali Shariati's project? I want, and I've been searching all my life, for Moses who stood against Pharaoh. Who the moment that he climbed up to that mount in order to receive the 10 Commandments and the tablets, his own people went and built a golden calf. This is how easy it is to feed into the world of the above in the absence of prophecies and a prophet to guide. I want Jesus who stood against poverty and shielded Mary Magdalene from his own siblings. Where is Mohamed who upheld Millat Ibrahim, or the path of Ibrahim, and fought for social justice? That is my quest. So I don't see the muqawama, the resistance that is so fetishized, and by the way, who are not on the same page. Don't sit down and tell me that Iran and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad and Hamas all share the same set of values. They don't. There is no unity of the field. That is a lie. They all have different investments, different commitments that will rupture each other's alliances at different moments. And we can come back to this point later. But I don't see the Muqawma, I don't see Abu Ubaidah sitting down and quoting Marx and Hegel and Mao and Stalin, who for the life of me, I don't know how Lenin and Stalin made a comeback. But I get it. There's obviously a legacy of unbequeathed from my era, my supposed what, Generation X, that hasn't been passed on to people that are all of a sudden discovering resistance, as if nothing has been happening since Seattle till the Arab Spring. Subhanallah. Read, the Prophet was told. Iqra thumma iqra thumma iqra. Read, then read, then read. He wasn't even told read this or that, or read this from the Qur'an. Read everything that you agree or disagree with. Read Mein Kampf so you can understand what white supremacy is, what Nazism is. Read that which you disagree with and that which you agree with. Perhaps it will elucidate and illuminate your mind, your spirit, your soul. And it was our beloved elder and ancestor, Kwame Ture, the spiritual Pan-African revolutionist, who also put, which now brings us to this moment, that mobilization is not the same as organization. I'm going to say that again. Mobilization revolves around issues. Organization, as Kwame had defined it, revolves around structures. Malcolm was a great organizer and mobilizer. MLK, may he rest in power, was a great mobilizer. But Malcolm was a great organizer and mobilizer. Now this bears relevance to the point that I'm now going to make. Engaging BTS, block ports, shipping, commerce, travel, trade, ruin even a white liberal's day. But recognize that there is a white liberal that exists inside each and every single one of us. Again, there are black, brown, red-skinned folks with white masks. It's the devil that's inside. But that is not going to liberate Palestine. These are tactics, that is not a strategy. There is no freeing Palestine without, again, freeing this very territory, what is referred to as Turtle Island. So I shudder to think that I've been a witness over the past 16 months to, and I'm not minimizing of direct action or protest, folks, but sorry, after that career and that experience there of the 18 days that I lived, it has become less relevant to me. I'm interested in building alternatives on the land. Revolutions involve practical questions. How are you going to live differently? What are you going to do insofar as when somebody's hungry, when somebody needs water? How are you going to transform? Beyond the shi'arat, beyond the slogans, bread, freedom, and social justice. You can go and ask, as I did in Tahrir, what does bread and freedom and social justice means to you, even to the revolutionary socialists, to the same enclave of people, and they will give you different responses. There may be people that believe in your cause. Again, a single trans mother that needs to feed her 2 or 3 kids, but she'll ask you, how do I pay the rent? How do I feed my kids? Beyond the transformation of self, the Muslims often read this ayah, this verse, Allah la yughayyiru ma biqawmin hatta yughayyiru ma bi anfusihim. God does not change a people until they change themselves. Not Mubarak, not Trump, not Biden, themselves. Structures. Changing the operator doesn't change the structure that we're contending with. So right now, we've been witness 15 months. Conservative Muslims that are against critical race theory, queer theory, gender theory, marching right next to anti-Zionist Jews, marching right next to queer communities, marching right next to who? Anti-spiritual leftists, and everybody's yelling free, free Palestine. And I go around and ask, what does a free Palestine mean to any of you? And nobody can answer me. We don't even know what we're fighting against, let alone what we're fighting for. And so going back to this point, Lukrama, Lumumba, Sankara, Walter Rodney, Toure, who says, our people have never seen religion as the opium of the masses. That, of course, comes directly out of European culture. For African religion and revolution go hand in hand. If one is truly religious, one must be revolutionary. And of course, we need to then distinguish between religion, and its organized or anti-hierarchical forms, because these are different, let alone the concept of faith, which is a different category in Islam, let alone spirituality, ruhaniyya. Faith means, or the closest word is iman. The closest word synonymous to the word religion in Islam or in Arabic is deen, although that doesn't really encapsulate the word religion. This is the problem and the violence of everything needs to be translatable into the white European mindset so that it makes sense, so that it's rational. But how many times does the word Muslim appear in the Qur'an? Actually 5 or 6 times. What is the emphasis on? It's the emphasis on the concept of mu'minin, believers. Well, let's just sit down and look at what ontologically and epistemologically defines a believer. Well, that who does not corrupt in the earth, who minds their rights and responsibilities towards the orphan, towards the poor, the destitute, who does not corrupt in the land, who does not engage in israf or waste. So we begin to develop a different cosmology of what is the believer. This is why, and as I'll be talking tomorrow's lecture, about the concept of ummah and how sovereignty lies in the ummah, because there is no such thing as an Islamic state. But the humanity is astounding, y'all. We have Nat Turner, we have Malcolm, we have MLK, we have Tolstoy, we have Ali Shariati, we have Dorothy Day, we have Jack Al-Lul, Abdullah Jafari, and so on and so forth, to name a few. But yet I see this reinstantiation that as leftists, we need to be anti-spiritual, denying the fact that we have Islamic, Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, socialisms, Marxisms, anarchisms. And this is where secularism masks its Christian ethos. That Edward Glosson, that Frantz Fanon, that Amy César, that Sylvia Winter, who discussed a great deal, 1492, Ila Shuhat too, myself, Linda Kickbert, as well, the importance of that here. How secularism is a colonial crusading construct, Alberto Toscano similarly writes, the constant reiteration of secularism as the key stake of the current religious and political crisis is this hard-won result of the history of Christendom, which can allegedly explain both the civilizational sub-alternity of the Muslim world, although there is no such thing as a Muslim world, I reject that concept, and its supposed collective rage. There's no Arab world either. So this is about, really, again, cultures of whiteness, because I don't see that a white person being born white. I mean, you have Arabs that are what, passing. World shapes and creeds and colors and sizes, that's not the point. But it's the privilege in relationship to structures and structures of power. But we've all internalized cultures of whiteness, all of us. And this entails then a different kind of commitment, in terms of responsibilities in our human life. We need to learn to walk the land as opposed to walking on the land. I'm going to say that again. We need to learn to walk with our Mother Earth as opposed to walking on her. And the beauty, of course, of anti-authoritarianism, and I don't give a damn about the label anarchism anymore, is the fact that power is constantly fluid. But what the nation state does, and let me point to the element of the mass psychology of fascism that George Jackson, Blood in My Eye, William Reich, who wrote the mass psychology of fascism, and Deleuze and Guattari actually also discussed this concept, that I rely on my builder. Our real Oedipal parents are the nation state of capitalism. Daddy is the state. The state is daddy. Daddy teaches me how to control, how to judge, how to govern myself and others. How to categorize, oh, you're black, you're white, you're brown, you're this or that. You're not FTMO, so you must be MTF. And capitalism is the mother, the loving mother, the very bosom of which we all rely insofar as imperialization, utilitarian conceptualization of love, of friendship. Oh, Valentine's Day, Hallmark cards. Oh, Pride. There you go, surrounded by Heineken bottles, and so on and so forth. Commercialization of every facet and element of our existence, including water that is bottled and sold, air, for God's sake. But these are actual real parents. The nation state as daddy and capitalism as mommy. Che Guevara on t-shirts, symbol of anti-capitalist resistance on a shirt, whatever it is that you eat, whatever it is that you want. But this is why I come and say, this is about the politics of responsibility. You don't have rights until you know what your responsibilities are to others and yourself. And yet what I consistently see, I think as we all see at this point, okay, we moved from Seattle in 1999 to Indigenous land defending, in my case, insofar as the Mohawks, 45 minutes from where I used to live in Kingston, Ontario, in Canada, where I attended Queen's University and became involved. And we see in 2011 the so-called Arab Spring, the Tahrir uprisings that became an Islamist winter, a term that I'm going to conclude on in a few minutes. And then we had Occupy, and what the hell is Occupy when we're occupying already colonized land, as Joanna Barker had noted? Terms, language, the hollowing out of meanings. But then, of course, no Dakota, water protectors, and then BLM, Black Lives Matter, the Black Spring, as Robin D.J. Kelly had notes. Right. So let me just pause here for a second. Are there no Trayvon Martins, Michael Browns, Sandra Bland's, George Floyd's, Breonna Taylor's? So we move on? Is that the understanding? Okay. Now we moved on to Palestine. Okay. And what does Black Lives Matter mean in the context of Africa? Africa. The size of the US, China, India, East and West Europe. For God's sake, that is the size of Africa. Black Lives Matter don't matter there. AFRICOM and its imperialist presence in Africa is irrelevant there. It's not about naming a bunch of Confederate bases that are going to be renamed according to the Confederate generals. If he hasn't done this already, Mr. Agent Orange, who's now in power again. And good, I'm glad that he's in power because it seems that's the only way that people will actually be forced to make the difficult decisions that they have been avoiding the past 16 months. Are we dying? We're already destined to. It's been ongoing for 533 years. Are we going to suffer more? Yeah, but we're already suffering. Maybe that will wake us up. Because people's attention doesn't wait by simply tapping them on the shoulder anymore. anymore. You have to be hitting on the head with a sledgehammer, apparently, for us to really wake up. 38 million refugees, displaced persons since the so-called War on Terror, 5 million murdered. Let alone the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, that are underneath the rubble in Gaza. We don't know. Nameless figures, nameless people, lives, cosmos, worlds that we will never get to know. Like Kindred. Over 300 bullets in this 8-year-old's body. 300 bullets! Her body was riddled as she was crying out for her mother, for an ambulance worker, to rescue her. So solidarity in so many different ways is a verb. It involves, as I'll be speaking in the last lecture, an ethics of disagreements and a politics of hospitality. On the left, none of that exists. You see, we tear each other apart according to ideological underpinnings. The Marxists hate the anarchists, the queers hate I don't know what, this hates that hates the other person, right? We only need to circle around and we engage in a firing squad. The right doesn't have to worry about anything because we have perfected the art of COINTELPRO against one another. We relish tearing each other apart. This is how easy to throw each other underneath the bus. An Islam of the oppressed. That is what I'm after. Sorry, can I use more of the time? And forgive me if there's less Q&A again today. But I really feel that these are the foundations because I have to do justice to certain things so that it's not rhetoric. I value rhetoric, very much so. I am a polemicist, but at the same time, there has to be an element of substance here. This is not a democracy. It never was, it never will be, and it can't be an American dream and what Malcolm called an American nightmare. That's the fork in the road, and people have to choose. It can't be both. And so there's a minor trivia, and again, I don't mean to take aim. I wasn't going to bring this up, but I might as well since I started. That the book begins with, insofar as I question the logic of who is upheld. And my targeting or my critique is not of the person. But I begin the book by talking about, at the height of Black Lives Matter, how Sister Ilhan Omar, who was a Somali refugee, was being flanked by Angela Davis. And she started off by saying, this country is founded on genocide. Actually, it's an ongoing genocide, sister. And by the way, again, my critique is not for the person, nor do I condone the anti-blackness against her, nor the false anti-Jewish charges that are leveled against her either. Okay. But she says, it's founded on genocide. Actually, it's an ongoing genocide, sister. And it's founded on slavery. Actually, it's Afterlife to Slavery Project, sister. Somebody of Army refers to it. But look at me, I'm an example of the American dream, she says. Look at me, I'm an example of the American dream, but it's not just her. I mean, she quotes, of course, when she's asked in 2 separate interviews, well, who do you look up to in terms of women, in terms of ideals, political ideals? And she names Margaret Thatcher, the mother of neoliberalism, and Madeleine Albright, the architect of the World Food Program that killed a million Iraqi children. These are truths. But there's also Rashida Tlaib, whose sister, at the height of the Reject the Voting campaign, desired and was coveting, on bended knees, to be platformed within the Democratic Party. And on that table, she sat down during a press conference and says, crying, and I feel the pain, these are my people too. My people too. She comes about and says, well, I want Gazans to live the American dream. I lived it. Who says that they want the American dream? Is that what Rifat al-Hariri was saying? Who was massacred and was killed, amongst many in this process of scholasticide and the destruction of universities, let alone professors, and the archives of memory, of knowledge that they are? Is this sacrifice of what our people are dying for, of what October 7th was about? Okay. So this foundation, this obsession, this sadistic, neurotic, psychotic obsession with this American dream has to end. Because this dream lays in its fodder the pitting of indigenous against indigenous, of black against black, that continues. We are all creased by white settler colonialism here. And of course, we have anti-blackness within Arab, Muslim, and South Asian communities. Make no mistake, let alone pure phobia and sexism and so on and so forth, that this is why we're one of the oppressed. And the need for alternative governance. But we've all internalized degrees of blood quantum logic that functions differently. And the white man was so insidious that he would create blood quantum in order that, of course, Hitler had relied on insofar as Shoah. He was drawing on the legacy of it here. And the legacy of it here was targeting indigenous people to dispossess them from land and to keep the black a slave. That was the sick logic. But this is why there is no indigenous liberation without black self-determination here. We have Afro-Indigenous futurities that are intertwined with one another. Indigenous people have been conscripted towards black enslavement, and black people have been conscripted towards indigenous extermination, the pitting of all against all. But to put again, and to do justice, from 100 million strong to fewer than 2% of the total US population, this took detailed planning, vicious planning, legislation, forced relocation, residential schools, starvation, contaminated smallpox blankets, bounties on their scouts in a society in which cavalry troops have been replaced by police shootings, slave catchers, that engage in incarceration, desecration of reserved lands, foster care, lack of infrastructure and services, poverty as a mode and a tool of ethnic cleansing. This is real. Genocide is not a metaphor, nor is decolonization, folks. And so the genocide continues today, and they continue vis-a-vis unapologetically deemed merciless Indian savages in the US Declaration of Independence and within settler psyches, including the one standing before you. And this is nothing to say or to say nothing with regards to indigenous boarding schools. Those lived impacts exist to this day. A 150-year program of separating children from their families. That was part of federal policy to eradicate indigenous communities, identities, spirituality, cosmology, and historical material relationships to that, and to forcibly take their rights. The US operated or supported more than 408 boarding institutions in 37 states between 1819 and 1969, many of which were run by churches, that's what I'm saying, it's a crusading project, and religious organizations. 431 schools identified in total. When counting schools with multiple sites, about 20 of these schools accounting for over 500 child deaths. 50 mass burial sites, both marked and unmarked, that are still being unearthed. Emotional, physical, sexual, transgenerational abuse that remains rampant, in addition to, like I said, malnutrition, overcrowding, lack of health care. Indigenous children were given new English names, their haircuts. They were forbidden from speaking their own mother tongues and from engaging in their cultural practices. Kids who died because of the abusive experiences that they underwent being buried in unmarked graves. This is my awe, by the way, and it's not some romanticization of indigenous people, that despite everything that they continue to go through, the degree of resurgence and adamancy with regards to who they are, and what they are seeking on this very land, not only for themselves, but towards others. The very presence of somebody like me is facilitated vis-a-vis treaties. But yet, ironically, as a Muslim, this is the thing, there are 2 billion of us. We have our land, we have our resources, we have our traditions, we have our Qur'an, we have this, we have that. Yet look at how fickle and frail we are as the foam on the oceans when it crashes into the rock. Nothing. We amount to nothing. We've abandoned knowledge. We've abandoned our original teachings. And of course, the US paid for a large proportion of the system vis-a-vis forced assimilation with money that's superficially owed to indigenous people underneath treaties to cede their land to the so-called United States or to the American entity. Arrangements, of course, that were coerced. Now we're in a stage of 69 hot cities. 5,203 missing indigenous girls and women in 2021 alone. We don't even have the appropriate statistics. So we're talking about indigenous women disappearing at a rate equal of more than 2.5 times their estimated share of the US population. Indigenous women are twice as likely to be raped in comparison to white women. Murder is the third leading cause of death for indigenous women, often perpetrated by, guess who, non-indigenous people. More than half of indigenous women have experienced sexual violence. Indigenous people in the US whose very land we stand on, whose very sovereignty as nations is disregarded every single day. Every single day one carries the Pledge of Allegiance in a school, in a nursery, in a library, when we go to work, when we identify as Americans. Murder, like I said, we have indigenous women or indigenous people whose very land we stand on, whose sovereignty is being desecrated. The smallest racial group, 8% of the population, represent 2% of these things. Incarcerated at a rate 38% higher than the national average. Indigenous youth are 30% more likely than whites to be referred to insofar as juvenile courts. And indigenous children are constantly being removed from their homes by state social services agencies at a far higher rate than any other child. But like I said, we also have afterlife of slavery projects. Slavery is constantly being rebirthed. Stand your ground laws, police brutality, premeditated extrajudicial killings, stop and frisk policies, policies of broken windows, voter disenfranchisement, school-to-prison pipelines, impoverishment, premature deaths, 1994 crime bills that Hillary Clinton and soft champagne Zionist imperialist Bernie Sanders had voted for, referring to black youth as super predators and thugs. This is the Bernie that people were hinging their cards on, as well as AUC and that progressive liberal crowd. I don't call myself a progressive. I'm a radical, goes straight to the roots. So representative democracy is not much of a democracy when it's laden with racialized district remapping, voter disenfranchisement and suppression, partisan gerrymandering, dark money ads, electoral college systems that are often pegged against the popular vote, blah, blah. 2010 Citizen United verdicts that give special interest groups unlimited spending, bills like 5014C that permit designated social welfare organizations to engage in electoral politics. What democracy? Now to the final quadrant of the discussion. To go back to this question of Islam. I don't need you to believe in the possibility of an anarchistic interpretation of Islam or an Islamic reading of anarchism. I guess that's for tomorrow for you to judge for yourselves. I have an issue, though, with labels as Islamism as political Islam. Okay? Why? Because that assumes that Islam is politicized as opposed to the fact that any idea is inherently political, any idea is inherently spiritual. But I want to give a little bit of history to show the extent of colonization, again, in the abstract use of this term Islamism, or political Islam, that really emerges and appears in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century in French and British, and I traced it into even Bavarian sort of origins of that term, Islamism. And you'll find it in the rights of Hobbes, Kant, Rousseau, Renan, Emile Voltaire, Tocqueville, all basically the founding fathers, if you will, of enlightenment. This is why the very bosom of white supremacy lies there. Right? I actually fear the liberal, the white man that comes about and says, well, I don't see race. So, excuse me? I would rather be called a San Negro to my face by a white supremacist than deal with the liberal that comes about and says, well, I can't be racist. And this happened, by the way. I sat down in a meeting once, this was many years ago, and I was a student at the time. And this professor, sorry, minor tangential story, was a white woman who had adopted a black child from Africa. And we were discussing about whether the fact that we should include more critical race as well as black studies within the context of sociology. And she turns around at all of us, including me, a graduate student, and says, well, I can't be racist. I stroke black skin every morning. Excuse me? Well, Jefferson and Washington and a lot of the founding fathers, let alone white supremacists, have done that every single day in their life. And it's called rape. It's called child abuse. It's called a lot of different things. It's called pedophilia. It's called a lot of different things for you to engage in that kind of, again, flippant use of language and words. But this is the demeaning nature of words and language. And this is where I began. But this is Alexis Tocqueville. I'm sure Americans know him pretty well. In 1838, he noted that he discovered the root of Islamicism in Judaism. Of course, I always describe Islam as Judaism universal. And he writes in his French classic, Democracy in America, Mohamed brought down from heaven and put into the Qur'an not religious doctrines only, but political maxims, criminal and civil laws, and scientific theories. The gospel, on the other hand, deal only with the general relations between man and God and between man and man. Beyond that, they teach nothing, he says, and do not oblige people to believe in anything. That alone, amongst 1,000 reasons, is enough to show that Islam will not be able to hold its power long in ages of enlightenment and democracy, while Christianity is destined to reign in such ages as in all others. As in all others. In 1822, a Bavarian official by the name of Joseph Ritter von Hausi writes that the term Islamicists, because they use that term, or Mohammedism, to exude in Orientalist fashion that there's something exceptional, parasitic, vile, disgusting with regards to this tradition. They are not like us. They are the other of the other, if you will. And so he writes the term Islamicist as if it is interchangeable with the term Islam. Muslims see themselves as God's children. We actually don't. And notes that the Prophet Muhammad was a ruler. He actually wasn't. وَمَا مُحَمَّدٌ إِلَّا رَسُولٌ جَاءَتْ مِنْ قَبْلِهِ الرُّسُلُ. Muhammad was nothing but a prophet and a messenger, as prophets and messengers that were sent before him. Jesus, Moses, stretching all the way to Abraham, all the way to Adam and Hawa. And no, in Islamic tradition, Eve is not made from the rib of Adam. They were a single spirit that was split into two. Look at the beauty. Look at the egalitarians. Yet we are the ones that are savage, and we are the ones that are inherently sexist. But Joseph writes, the first article of this religion, Islam, was that there is only one God, and Muhammad, he spelled it with a T, is its greatest and last prophet. Only him had the right to rule, and only his followers are true believers, despite what I recited the verses of the Qur'an, insofar as the concept of mu'mineen, believers. And they are the only ones who are truly God's children. And only for them was the world as paradise. Thus he gave his religion a political tendency. Now this is the key. Contrary to the Christian religion that supposedly doesn't have a political tendency. It opens free range to conquer the entire world. Instead, the way Christianity preaches grace and charity. Well, not the white man's Christianity. I'm sure of that. Islam condemns this, preaching hatred, persecution, even obliteration for those who do not follow Islamicists. George Sale, in 1783, in his Orientalist English translation of the Quran, writes, it is certainly one of the most convincing proofs that Mohammedism was no other than a human invention, that it owed its progress and establishment almost to nothing. So there is a spectrum of so-called political Islam, or understandings of politics within Islam. And that becomes simply my point, that it is Islam with a range, and that range is impacted by a colonial conquistador project that has been ongoing for 533 years. But that brings me to an important point. Muslims lost their way a long time ago. I would argue from the moment that the Prophet, peace be upon him, died, even before what is referred to as the four rightly guided Khalifs. Umar, Uthman, Abu Bakr, and Ali. I'm not naming them in chronological order. And we lost our trajectory because we lost our original teachings and access. Because as we began to build and bury ourselves in the sand, seeking the world of the above, we lost sight of our responsibilities to non-human life, and that opened a gateway to the very colonization of Turtle Island, and a shame on us, a plague upon us and our people. And until we restore the Qur'an of the oppressed, neither we nor frankly will others be allowed to live, be allowed to survive, let alone to thrive. I'll conclude now, and we'll talk about, inshallah, the next two talks in the coming days. I'll conclude with our guerrilla intellectual, Walter Rodney, and how Europe underdeveloped Africa. A culture is a total way of life. It embraces what people eat, what they wore, the way they walked, the way they talked, the manner in which they treated death and greeted the newborn. There's a reason, folks, that I'm very proud of my students and the fact that I was a part of That in their lives, we never imagined when the Colombian encampment came to the scene that it would spread as wildfire all across the globe. But as I told my students, we are not in a battle, in a war with Columbia University, a secular, colonial, hierarchical, patriarchal, misogynist, queerphobic institution. We're at war with the settler states. Why else would Shai Gavitai and others be calling for the intervention of the National Guard, let alone the NYPD, who train, as we all know, with the Zionist entity and have exchange programs? We are at war. But what the students, and forgive me, I sometimes call them the kids, it's not patronizing, in a patronizing way, but they are my younger siblings. They invented a portal in which we as adults are capable of redreaming dangerously. Those encampments were not just encampments. They are moments as Tahrir, as North Dakota, as Black Lives Matter, as the Black Spring, and so on and so forth. And they opened a portal into a world where all worlds fit. You had anti-Zionist Jews praying right next to Muslims, right next to Hindus, right next to Christians, right next to Sabians, Zoroastrians, Buddhists. Students were learning more in those encampments than they were with the classroom, because we had broken the corridor, the control silo of this is sociology, and this is political science, and this is gender studies, and so on and so forth. Because they were living on the land together, because they had the opportunity to look each other in the eyes, and this is what solidarity demands, of being on the land together. This is practically the only thing I agree with Hegel on. The eyes are the windows to the soul. And yes, one needs to read Hegel or Marx. I don't understand people that read Hegel after Marx. But I think you're seeing my point. They inspired the world. And the youth, they dreamed dangerously. They loved profoundly. And they struggled, and they are still struggling. But as I said to them, you need to take the spirit as the spirit of Tahrir to the neighborhoods, the gentrified, the poor, the Black, the Indigenous reserves. This is where organizing really becomes crucial and vital. I shudder to think that us as people of color are mostly urbanized, including Indigenous people. Yet we're sitting down at the downfall of capitalism and the fall of capitalism. We don't even know how to grow our own food to feed ourselves, let alone our communities, let alone our friends and our families. But who controls the vast landscape of land? It's the white farmer that is armed to the teeth with stamp decrees, that is ready to go U-Haul on the urban metropolis. They're the ones that feed the metropolis, yet we were disconnected from our very mother. Revolutions involve practical questions, changing the way that we eat, the way that we breathe, the way that we conceive of intimacy, the way that we fuck, privacy, what is public, everything. The very geographies, the very architecture of space and time. And yes, we can engage in an urban zapatismo, and not just engage in rural forms of zapatismo, as our warriors in the La Condana jungle taught us. Let me end again by the very words of our ancestor, Kwame Stokely Carmichael. The knowledge I have now, and I create tomorrow, and the moment after here, and onwards, is not the knowledge I had then. I am a past, I am a present becoming future. I am a set of conjunctive ends. George Jackson, our martyr, says, and it follows, that if a thing is not a building, it is certainly decaying. That life is revolution. That the world will die if we do not read and act out its imperatives. So, be careful, because if you're not careful, newspapers will have you aiming at the very people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppression. Now, with that, for now, for today, I bid you all adieu, salam, shalom, hello, welcome. Thank you for being patient with me, and it's an honor to see you all. I look forward to knowing you all. Bless you.